London, 1817. They say that poverty is a sin no amount of virtue can absolve. I, Arabella Thornfield, never imagined that my father's ruin would place me at the mercy of high society's cruelty, that a single ball would shatter me publicly, that an enigmatic and tormented duke would offer me an impossible marriage. But what I truly did not know is that humiliation can be the prelude to the most extraordinary love. This is the story of a woman who lost everything except her dignity, and found a man who valued her precisely for that. But before we dive into this story that defied all the conventions of the Regency, tell me, from which corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. Truth is always more fascinating than fiction. There are moments in life when one's world shifts so completely that the person you were before becomes almost unrecognizable. For me, that transformation began not with a single catastrophic event, but with a series of small deaths. The death of my father's fortune, the death of his reputation, and finally, the death of the man himself. What remained was a ghost of a girl who once believed that birth and breeding were armor enough against the cruelties of the world. How foolish I had been. I was 19 when my father, Viscount Thornfield, lost everything. The particulars of his downfall were whispered about in drawing rooms across London, ill-advised investments in a shipping venture that literally sank, debts accumulated through years of living beyond our means, and gambling losses that would have been scandalous even if we could have afforded them. Pride, they say, comes before a fall. In my father's case, pride was not merely the precursor to his fall. It was the very rope from which he hanged his family's future. I remember the day the creditors came. I was in the morning room, embroidering a handkerchief with a delicacy that seemed laughable in retrospect. What use was fine needlework when there would soon be no fine linens to embroider? My father stood in the doorway, his face ashen, aged a decade in a single morning. He did not speak. He did not need to. I saw in his eyes the complete collapse of everything we had known. Within 3 months, Thornfield Hall was sold. The London townhouse followed shortly after. My mother's jewels, my grandmother's silver, the paintings that had hung in our gallery for generations, all of it went to settle debts that still left us penniless. My father retreated into himself, a hollow shell of the man who had once commanded respect in Parliament. I watched him fade like a watercolor left too long in the sun, each day a little more transparent, until one morning he simply did not wake. I was 21, and utterly alone in the world. The distant relatives who might have helped were either too impoverished themselves or too concerned with the taint of scandal my family name now carried. The friends who had filled our drawing rooms vanished like morning mist. I discovered, with a bitterness that still tasted sharp on my tongue 2 years later, that friendship in high society was a currency, and I was bankrupt in every sense that mattered. Lady Beatrice Ashford saved me, though saved might be too generous a word for what was essentially a business transaction. She was a widow of considerable fortune, and even more considerable ill temper, and she required a companion who could read to her, manage her correspondence, and serve as a convenient target for her caustic observations about the world. I fit her requirements perfectly, well-bred enough to understand the nuances of aristocratic life, desperate enough to accept wages that barely covered my modest needs, and sufficiently grateful to endure her mercurial moods without complaint. Or so she believed. The truth was more complicated. I was grateful, yes, but I was also proud, perhaps too proud for my circumstances. I performed my duties with meticulous care, but I never quite managed to adopt the self-effacing demeanor expected of someone in my position. Lady Beatrice seemed to find this amusing, in her way. She would make some particularly cutting remark about my delusions of grandeur, or my stubborn refusal to know my place, and I would meet her gaze with quiet dignity, neither arguing nor apologizing. I think, in some perverse way, she respected me for it. My days fell into a predictable rhythm. I rose early to organize Lady Beatrice's morning correspondence, read the gossip columns aloud while she took her breakfast, accompanied her on social calls where I sat in silent invisibility while she traded barbs with her equally formidable friends, and spent my evenings in the library, losing myself in novels that transported me far from the reality of my diminished circumstances. The most painful aspect of my new life was not the work itself, nor even Lady Beatrice's sharp tongue. It was the constant reminder of what I had lost. when we attended balls and soirees, and Lady Beatrice attended every significant social event, if only to maintain her position in society's complex hierarchy. I was forced to watch from the margins, as the life I might have lived played out before me. Young ladies in their first or second seasons, wearing gowns that cost more than I now earned in a year, danced with eligible gentlemen and whispered behind their fans about who might propose to whom. I had once been one of them. Now I was invisible, a piece of furniture that happened to be useful to Lady Beatrice. The worst part was encountering people I had known before my fall. Some had the decency to look uncomfortable when they saw me in my reduced circumstances. Others simply pretended not to recognize me at all, which was somehow more insulting than outright cruelty. And then there were those like Lady Constance Fairfax, who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from my misfortune. Lady Constance was a creature of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary malice. She had been a contemporary of mine during my debut season, and we had never been friends. She had resented my popularity then, the way young men had sought my company despite her more obvious attractions. Now that I was powerless, she had found her opportunity for revenge, and she pursued it with the dedication of a bloodhound on a scent. The Pembroke ball arrived like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and potentially devastating. Lady Beatrice had received her invitation months earlier, and she had no intention of declining, despite my quiet suggestion that perhaps she might send her regrets. She looked at me with something that might have been understanding, or might have been her usual skepticism. One could never quite tell with Lady Beatrice. Hiding never helped anyone, she said, her tone unusually gentle. Besides, you're my companion, not my prisoner. If you wish to stay home, you may, but we both knew I could not. Refusing to attend would have been seen as weakness, an admission that I could not face society. So I wore my best dress, the same jade silk I had worn to 3 previous events, carefully maintained but beginning to show its age, and accompanied Lady Beatrice to the grand Pembroke residence in Mayfair. The ballroom was a spectacle of wealth and elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing lights across silk gowns and gleaming jewels. The orchestra played a waltz that made my feet ache with the memory of dancing. I positioned myself in my usual spot, a chair slightly removed from the main gathering, close enough to fetch Lady Beatrice's champagne or shawl if needed, far enough to maintain the illusion that I was not really there. I was watching the dancers, allowing myself a moment of bitter-sweet nostalgia, when I heard her voice cut through the pleasant murmur of conversation. "But look there." Lady Constance's crystalline tone carried perfectly across the space between us. "It's poor Miss Thornfield, or should I say, Lady Beatrice's little shadow." I felt my spine straighten instinctively, even as my heart began to pound with dread. I had learned over 2 years to endure slights with quiet dignity, but something about the particular malice in her voice warned me that this would be different. She approached me with her coterie of equally vapid friends trailing behind her, their faces alight with anticipation of entertainment at my expense. Lady Constance was wearing a gown of ivory silk that probably cost more than my father's remaining debts, and she knew it. She positioned herself directly in front of me, ensuring that I could not look away without obvious rudeness. "Tell me, dear," she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "is that the same dress you wore 3 seasons ago? I'm quite certain I remember it from your debut year. How economical of you to make it last so long." Her friends tittered appreciatively. I felt every eye in our vicinity turn toward us, felt the familiar heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. The music seemed to fade, replaced by the rushing of blood in my ears. I could have remained silent. It would have been safer. But something in me, that stubborn pride that Lady Beatrice both mocked and respected, refused to give Lady Constance the satisfaction of my submission. "Fashion," I said, keeping my voice level despite the trembling I felt in my hands, "is considerably less important than character, Lady Constance, something that no amount of new gowns can purchase." It was a small victory, and a Pyrrhic one at that. Lady Constance's eyes flashed with genuine anger. I had dared to suggest that she lacked character, and we both knew it was true. Her next words would have been even more cutting, I'm certain, designed to put me firmly back in my place. But she never got the chance to speak them. The crowd around us had grown, drawn by the spectacle of my humiliation. Through the sea of faces, some sympathetic, most merely curious, a few openly enjoying my discomfort, I saw him. Alexander Ashford, Duke of Winterbourne, Lady Beatrice's nephew, and one of the most powerful men in England. I knew of him, of course. He visited his aunt occasionally, brief appearances marked by formal courtesy and a palpable desire to escape as quickly as propriety allowed. He treated me with the same polite indifference one might show a particularly well-behaved servant, acknowledgement of my existence, but nothing more. I had formed an impression of him over these encounters, cold, controlled, and completely uninterested in anything beyond his duties and responsibilities. He was handsome in an austere way, tall and lean, with black hair that fell across his forehead despite his best efforts, and eyes the color of a winter storm. His face was all sharp angles and rigid control, as if he had carved himself from granite and refused to show any crack in the facade. They said his heart had been buried with his wife 5 years ago, and looking at him, I believed it. He seemed less a man than a monument to duty and obligation. I had seen him enter the ballroom earlier in the evening, had watched him perform his social duties with mechanical precision. A word here, a nod there, nothing that suggested genuine engagement or interest. I had assumed he would not even notice the small drama unfolding in our corner of the room, but his eyes found mine across the crowd, and for one impossible moment, the world contracted to just that connection. His gaze was not cold, as I had always thought. It was burning with something I could not name, fury, perhaps, or something even more dangerous. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching briefly at his sides before he mastered whatever emotion had gripped him. Then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. He turned away, engaging in conversation with a portly gentleman I recognized as Lord Pemberton, and I was left with the unsettling sensation that something fundamental had shifted, though I could not begin to guess what. Lady Constance, unaware of the brief exchange, continued her assault. "Character," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "How philosophical of you, Miss Thornfield. But I fear philosophy matters little when one is dependent on the charity of others for one's very survival. Tell me, is Lady Beatrice a demanding mistress? Does she at least pay you enough to afford a new dress now and then?" The cruelty was breathtaking in its casualness. Around us, I heard gasps. Even by the standards of the ton, this was beyond acceptable behavior. But no one intervened. No one dared challenge someone of Lady Constance's standing for the sake of a fallen nobody like me. I stood, slowly, and with all the grace I could muster. My legs felt weak, my vision slightly blurred with tears I absolutely refused to shed in this moment, in this place, before these people. I looked Lady Constance directly in her beautiful, empty eyes. "I thank you for your concern about my circumstances," I said, proud that my voice did not shake. "It is truly touching to know that someone of your elevated position spares time to think of those less fortunate. Now, if you will excuse me, I believe Lady Beatrice requires my assistance." It was a retreat, and we both knew it, but it was the most dignified retreat I could manage under the circumstances. I walked away with my head high, feeling the weight of dozens of stares following my progress across the ballroom. Behind me, I heard Lady Constance's satisfied laughter, the sound of a predator who had successfully brought down her prey. Lady Beatrice, when I reached her, looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something that might have been anger on someone else, though on her it manifested as a tightening around her eyes and mouth. "That vicious little harpy," she muttered, surprising me. Lady Beatrice was many things, but she rarely showed open sympathy. She has the manners of a fishwife and the soul of a viper. "She is not wrong," I said quietly, accepting the glass of champagne she pressed into my hand. "I am dependent on your charity. I have no position, no prospects, nothing but my pride, and even that is barely intact." "Pride," Lady Beatrice said sharply, "is the only thing you have that's truly yours. Never apologize for it, and for what it's worth, child, you handled that with more grace than that painted peacock deserves." I managed a weak smile, grateful for her unexpected support, but inside, I felt something breaking. How much longer could I endure this? How many more humiliations would I be forced to suffer before I could no longer maintain my composure? What future waited for me beyond this endless parade of reminders of everything I had lost? I glanced back across the ballroom, seeking I knew not what, perhaps just a moment to compose myself, before facing the remainder of the evening. My eyes found him again, the Duke of Winterbourne, still engaged in conversation, but with his gaze now fixed firmly on me. Even from across the crowded room, I could feel the intensity of his regard. It was not pity. Thank God. It was not pity. It was something else entirely. Something that made my breath catch, and my heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with my recent humiliation. He did not smile. He did not nod in acknowledgement. He simply looked at me with those storm-gray eyes, and I had the strangest sensation that he was seeing not my degradation, but something else entirely. Something I had forgotten existed. Then someone blocked my view, and when the path cleared again, he had turned away. But the feeling remained, that unsettling awareness that something had changed, that invisible wheels had been set in motion, though I could not imagine what they might be, or where they might lead. I finished my champagne, and prepared to endure the remainder of the evening, as I had endured everything else. Whatever that moment had meant, it was surely nothing but my imagination, desperate to find kindness where none existed. I could not have been more wrong. 3 days later, my entire life would change. But in that moment, standing in the Pembroke ballroom with my pride in tatters and my future uncertain, I could not have imagined the extraordinary twist my fate was about to take. Sometimes the gods of fortune have a peculiar sense of humor. Mine was about to reveal itself in the most unexpected way possible. 3 days passed in a fog of routine and careful avoidance. I performed my duties for Lady Beatrice with mechanical precision, read her correspondence without truly absorbing the words, and retreated to my small room each evening where I could finally drop the mask of composure I wore throughout the day. The humiliation at the Pembroke ball replayed itself in my mind with the persistence of a recurring nightmare, each iteration adding new layers of shame I had not noticed in the moment. Lady Beatrice, to my surprise, had been unusually gentle with me in the aftermath. She made no mention of the incident, asked no probing questions, and even dismissed me early one afternoon, suggesting I take a walk in the gardens. It was so uncharacteristic of her that I wondered if she was feeling unwell, but her sharp tongue remained intact when dealing with everyone else, so I concluded that she had simply decided to grant me a temporary reprieve from her usual acerbity. I should have known better. Lady Beatrice Ashford never did anything without purpose. It was late morning on the 4th day when everything changed. I was in the library, cataloging a recent shipment of books Lady Beatrice had purchased, more for show than actual reading, as she preferred gossip columns to literature, when Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with an expression that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Miss Thornfield," she said, her tone formal in a way that suggested something significant was about to occur. "Lady Beatrice requests your presence in her private sitting room. Immediately." The word immediately sent a chill through me. In the 2 years I had served Lady Beatrice, she had never used such urgent summons unless she was particularly displeased about something. Had I made some error I was unaware of? Was she finally tired of my services and preparing to dismiss me? I followed Mrs. Hartwell through the familiar corridors of the Ashford townhouse, my heart beating an irregular rhythm against my ribs. The sitting room was Lady Beatrice's domain, a space decorated with her particular taste for rich fabrics and uncomfortable furniture that somehow perfectly reflected her personality, beautiful but uninviting. I paused at the threshold, and my breath caught in my throat. Lady Beatrice was not alone. Standing by the fireplace, his tall frame radiating a controlled tension that seemed to fill the entire room, was Alexander Ashford, Duke of Winterbourne. This was unusual on multiple levels. First, the Duke rarely visited his aunt during morning hours. His previous calls had always been brief afternoon affairs, duty visits performed with admirable efficiency. Second, he had never, in my memory, been present when I was specifically summoned. Our interactions had been limited to polite nods in passing, the occasional murmured greeting, nothing more. And third, most unsettling of all, he was looking directly at me with an intensity that made me want to simultaneously flee the room and step closer to discover what lay behind those storm-gray eyes. "Ah, Arabella," Lady Beatrice said, using my given name rather than the more formal Miss Thornfield she typically employed. Another warning sign. "Do come in and close the door. What we have to discuss requires privacy." I obeyed, my hands trembling slightly as I shut the door behind me. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. I clasped my hands in front of me to still their shaking and waited, every instinct screaming that I was about to receive news that would alter my carefully maintained equilibrium. Lady Beatrice settled herself in her favorite chair, a throne-like monstrosity upholstered in deep burgundy, and regarded me with an expression I could not quite decipher. If I did not know better, I might have thought it was sympathy. "My nephew," she began without preamble, "has something he wishes to discuss with you. Something that I have counseled him against, I might add. But the stubborn fool has made up his mind, and there is no reasoning with an Ashford when they've decided on a course of action." She shot the Duke a look that managed to be both fond and exasperated. "I shall leave you to speak privately, as he insists this is necessary, but I will be right outside should you need me." With that cryptic statement, she rose and swept from the room, leaving me alone with the Duke of Winterbourne for the first time in my life. The silence that followed her departure was suffocating. I remained where I was, near the door, while he stood by the fireplace, seemingly fascinated by the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than I remembered, rough with some emotion I could not identify. "Miss Thornfield, I apologize for the unusual nature of this meeting. I realize that being summoned and then left alone with a man of my position is highly irregular, but what I have to propose requires candor that would be impossible in company. Propose." The word hung in the air between us, laden with implications that my mind refused to process. Surely he could not mean, but no, that was impossible. Dukes did not propose anything to destitute companions of their elderly aunts. I must have misunderstood. "Your Grace," I managed, proud that my voice remained steady, "I confess I am at a loss to understand why you would need to speak with me at all, much less privately." He turned then, and the full force of his attention hit me like a physical blow. Up close, away from the crowds and the careful social masks, he was even more striking than I had realized. But it was not his physical appearance that arrested me. It was the raw emotion I saw flickering in his eyes before he shuttered it away. Pain, perhaps. Desperation, certainly. And something else that looked almost like resignation. "I need a wife," he said bluntly, and I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. Of all the things I had imagined he might say, this had not even entered the realm of possibility. I stared at him, waiting for clarification, explanation, some indication that I had misheard or misunderstood. When none came, I found my voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I beg your pardon?" He moved away from the fireplace, beginning to pace the length of the room with barely controlled agitation. It was the first time I had seen him display anything approaching disorder, and somehow that made everything more real and infinitely more terrifying. "I need a wife," he repeated, his tone flat, but his movements betraying his inner turmoil. "More specifically, I need to be seen to have a wife, to produce an heir, to fulfill the expectations of society and my position. The details are complicated, and frankly, none of your concern. What matters is that I require someone to fill this role, and I have determined that you would be suitable. Suitable." The word struck me with the force of an insult, though I suspected he had not intended it as such. I was suitable. Not desirable, not valued, but suitable, like a piece of furniture that would serve a purpose adequately if not elegantly. "I see," I said, though I saw nothing at all. My mind was reeling, trying to process what he was suggesting and failing utterly. "And what precisely would this arrangement entail?" He stopped pacing and faced me directly. "A marriage in name only. You would become the Duchess of Winterbourne, with all the privileges and responsibilities that entails. You would have financial security, social position, respect, everything you have lost and more. In return, you would fulfill the public duties of a duchess, attend necessary events at my side, and maintain the appearance of a proper marriage." "A marriage in name only," I repeated slowly, testing the words. "You are proposing a business arrangement." "Precisely." He seemed relieved that I understood. "I have no interest in a love match, Miss Thornfield. My heart was buried with my late wife 5 years ago, and I have no desire to exhume it. What I offer you is a practical solution to both our problems. You need security and position. I need a wife who will not expect or demand emotional entanglement." There was something almost cruel in his honesty, though I suspected he thought he was being kind by being clear about his limitations. He was offering me everything I had lost: my place in society, financial security, an end to the daily humiliations I endured. All I had to do was accept that I would be nothing more than a convenient solution to his problem, a placeholder duchess who would occupy space in his life without touching his heart. Pride warred with pragmatism in my chest. Pride insisted that I refuse. that I tell him I would rather starve than accept such a cold arrangement. But pragmatism whispered that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford, that this might be my only chance to escape the slow death of spirit I was experiencing as Lady Beatrice's companion. "Why me?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Surely there are dozens of young ladies who would eagerly accept such an offer. Ladies with better connections, larger dowries, untarnished reputations. For the first time, something flickered across his face that might have been humor. That is precisely why not them. Ladies with connections come with families who will have expectations, demands, political entanglements. Ladies with dowries would expect their money to buy them influence over my decisions. And as for untarnished reputations, he paused, and I saw something shift in his expression. I witnessed what happened at the Pembroke ball, Miss Thornfield. Heat flooded my face, and I looked away, unable to bear the thought that he had seen my humiliation, that he pitied me enough to offer this bizarre proposal. "Do not mistake my meaning," he continued, his voice gentler now. "I do not offer this out of pity. I offer it because I saw in you something that all those other eligible young ladies lack. Genuine strength of character. You stood there, facing cruelty with nothing but your dignity as armor, and you did not break. You did not weep or beg or crumble. You faced your tormentor with grace and intelligence, and when you retreated, you did so with your head high." I looked back at him, startled by the passion that had crept into his voice. He seemed almost surprised by it himself, as if he had revealed more than he intended. "I need someone strong," he said more quietly. "Someone who will not expect me to be something I cannot be. Someone who understands that this is a transaction, not a romance. You have already proven you can endure hardship with grace. That is worth more to me than any dowry or political connection." His words should have comforted me. Instead, they only highlighted the essential loneliness of what he was proposing. We would be two people bound together by law and circumstance, but fundamentally separate, each protecting our wounded hearts from further damage. "And what," I asked, my voice barely steady, "makes you think I would accept such an arrangement? What makes you think I want to be part of a marriage that is merely a transaction?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw past all his careful control to the man beneath. Tired, wounded, desperately trying to fulfill obligations he had never wanted while protecting himself from further pain. "Because, Miss Thornfield, you are as pragmatic as you are proud. Because you understand that sometimes survival requires compromise. And because—" he hesitated, then continued with brutal honesty, "because I saw in your eyes at that ball the same thing I feel every day. The fury of being judged for circumstances beyond your control, the exhaustion of maintaining dignity in the face of constant assault, the bone-deep weariness of having to prove your worth again and again to people who have already decided you have none." His words struck something deep within me, some truth I had not allowed myself to acknowledge. Yes, I was tired. Yes, I was furious. Yes, I was weary of fighting a battle I could never win, of maintaining pride that bought me nothing but more hardship. But accepting his proposal would mean surrendering something essential, the hope, however faint, that I might one day find genuine love, real partnership, a marriage that was more than a legal contract between two wounded people. "I need time to consider," I said finally, though I already knew what my answer would be. Pragmatism would win, as it always did, but I needed time to mourn the dreams I would be giving up, to make peace with the cold practicality of what I was about to accept. "Of course," he said, though something in his expression suggested he knew I would ultimately accept. "Take as much time as you need. I will return tomorrow for your answer." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Without turning to face me, he spoke one more time. "For what it is worth, Miss Thornfield, I want you to know that while I cannot offer you love, I can promise you respect. You will be treated with every courtesy due to your position. Your opinions will be valued, your privacy maintained, your dignity protected. It is not much, but it is genuine." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in Lady Beatrice's sitting room with the weight of an impossible decision pressing down on my shoulders. I sank into the nearest chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. My mind raced through possibilities and implications. As his Duchess, I would never again face the humiliation I had endured at the Pembroke ball. Lady Constance would have to curtsy to me. I would have power, position, resources to help others who found themselves in circumstances similar to my own. But I would also be bound to a man who had explicitly stated he would never love me, who saw me as nothing more than a convenient solution to his problem. I would wake each morning knowing that I was tolerated rather than cherished, respected rather than desired. It would be a life of comfort and security, but also of essential loneliness. Lady Beatrice entered a few moments later, her sharp eyes taking in my pale face and trembling hands with one glance. "He told you then," she said, settling back into her chair. "The absurd fool." "You knew?" I asked, though of course she had known. She had orchestrated the entire meeting. He asked my counsel, yes. I told him he was being ridiculous, that there were a dozen other ways to solve his political problems without involving you. But Ashford men are notoriously stubborn, and Alexander is more stubborn than most. She studied me with uncharacteristic gentleness. "What will you tell him?" "I do not know," I lied, because saying the truth aloud would make it too real. "It is a cold arrangement he proposes." "It is," Lady Beatrice agreed, "but cold arrangements have their advantages. No messy emotions to cloud judgment, no expectations to be disappointed. Simply two people fulfilling a contract." "Is that truly all you think marriage should be?" I asked, genuinely curious. "A contract?" Something flickered across her face. Grief, perhaps, or regret. "I think marriage can be many things, child. Love is beautiful when it happens, but it is rare and fragile, and often brings more pain than joy. Respect, compatibility, shared goals, these are steadier foundations, less romantic perhaps, but more reliable." "Did you love your husband?" The question escaped before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted my impertinence. But Lady Beatrice did not seem offended. "I did," she said quietly, "very much. And when he died, it nearly destroyed me. Sometimes I think my nephew has the right idea, protecting his heart by refusing to risk it again. Less pain that way, but also less joy," I whispered. "Yes," she agreed, "less joy, but Alexander has decided that is a price worth paying. The question is whether you can accept the same bargain." I left the sitting room without answering, retreating to my small bedroom where I could finally allow the tears I had been holding back to fall. I wept for the girl I had been, who believed in love and happy endings. I wept for my father, whose poor choices had led me to this impossible crossroads. And I wept for the future I was about to accept, safe and secure, but fundamentally hollow. By evening, my tears had dried, and my decision was made. When the Duke of Winterbourne returned the next day, as promised, I would give him my answer. I would become his duchess, his convenient solution, his transaction, and I would do my best to ignore the small, stubborn part of my heart that whispered, this was a terrible mistake, that I deserved more than respect and courtesy, that somewhere in the world there might be a man who would love me, not despite my circumstances, but because of the person those circumstances had forged. But that was a fairy tale, and I was too old for fairy tales now. It was time to be practical, to be pragmatic, to accept what was offered rather than yearning for what would never be. Tomorrow I would say yes, and in saying yes, I would close the door on any possibility of genuine love forever. Or so I believed. How little I understood about the man who had made me such a cold proposal, or about the heart he claimed was buried beyond resurrection. How little I knew about my own capacity to break through the walls we had both built around ourselves. But that revelation was still weeks away. In that moment, sitting alone in my room as twilight fell, I knew only that I was about to make a choice that would change everything, though whether for better or worse, only time would tell. The wedding took place on a gray morning in early November, a ceremony as cold and efficient as the arrangement it formalized. We were married in the private chapel of the Winterbourne estate by a bishop who had known Alexander since childhood and asked no uncomfortable questions about the haste of our union or the notable absence of warmth between bride and groom. Lady Beatrice attended, along with a handful of servants required as witnesses. No one else was invited. No one else would have come. I wore a dress of pale blue silk that Lady Beatrice had insisted on purchasing for me. "You may be entering a loveless marriage, but you need not look like you're attending a funeral," she had said with characteristic bluntness. My hands shook as I signed my name in the register, transforming myself with a few pen strokes from Arabella Thornfield, impoverished companion, to Arabella Ashford, Duchess of Winterbourne. Alexander, I could hardly think of him as my husband. spoke his vows in a steady voice devoid of emotion. When the bishop pronounced us man and wife, he kissed my cheek with the same distant courtesy he might show an elderly aunt. I told myself I was relieved by his restraint, that anything more would have been hypocritical given the nature of our arrangement. I told myself many lies in those first weeks of marriage. The Winterbourne townhouse in Mayfair was a revelation of wealth that made even Lady Beatrice's comfortable home seem modest by comparison. 5 stories of elegant architecture, rooms filled with priceless artwork and furniture that had belonged to Ashfords for generations, servants who moved through the halls like well-trained ghosts, appearing precisely when needed and vanishing just as efficiently. My new home was a palace, and I felt like an imposter wandering its corridors. My apartments, I had apartments, plural, rather than the single small room I had occupied at Lady Beatrice's, were decorated in soft greens and golds, feminine without being frivolous. A sitting room with a view of the gardens, a bedroom with a bed large enough for 4 people, a dressing room that could have housed my entire previous wardrobe 10 times over and still had space remaining. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and utterly foreign. Alexander's apartments were in the opposite wing. On our wedding night, after a dinner marked more by silence than conversation, he had escorted me to my door with perfect formality. "I trust you will find everything to your satisfaction," he had said, his tone no different than if he were addressing a guest. "Should you need anything, you have only to ring for your maid. I bid you good night, Your Grace. Your Grace." He called me by my title, as if my name had been erased along with my previous identity. I wanted to tell him that I was still Arabella, that a marriage certificate had not transformed me into someone else entirely, but the words died in my throat as I watched him walk away down the corridor, his shoulders rigid, his stride measured and controlled. I entered my beautiful cage and wept until I had no tears left. The following weeks established a pattern that would define our marriage, or rather, our arrangement masquerading as marriage. We breakfasted together, a concession to propriety that required us to sit at opposite ends of a table designed to seat 20, making desultory conversation about weather and upcoming social obligations. He inquired politely about my comfort, whether the household staff was meeting my needs, if there was anything I required. I assured him, equally politely, that everything was perfectly satisfactory. We were strangers sharing living quarters, nothing more. During the day, our paths rarely crossed. Alexander closeted himself in his study, managing his vast estates and attending to business in Parliament. I explored my new domain with the cautious steps of someone expecting to be told at any moment that she did not belong. The library became my sanctuary, 3 stories of books, reaching toward a ceiling painted with classical scenes of gods and muses. I could lose myself there for hours, pretending that my life was something other than the elegant sham it had become. Evenings brought our only true interaction. We dined together, another performance for the benefit of servants who would gossip if we kept entirely separate lives. Alexander would ask about my day with the same polite interest one might show a distant acquaintance. I would respond with carefully edited accounts that revealed nothing of my true thoughts or feelings. Then he would retire to his study, and I to my apartments, and the great house would settle into silence. It should have been enough. I had everything I had dreamed of during those long months as Lady Beatrice's companion. Security, comfort, respect. I was a duchess. People who had ignored me now scrambled for my attention. Invitations arrived daily, each more prestigious than the last. Modistes fought for the honor of dressing me. My name appeared in the society pages, always with flattering commentary about the Duke's unexpected but charming choice of bride. And yet, I was more lonely than I had ever been in my life. The cruelest part was the moments when Alexander's carefully maintained facade would slip, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the ice. Like the afternoon I found him in the library, staring at a portrait of his late wife, with an expression of such profound sorrow that I had backed away silently, unwilling to intrude on his private grief. Or the morning he had asked, with what seemed like genuine interest, about the novel I was reading, and we had spent 20 minutes discussing the merits of Gothic fiction before he seemed to catch himself and retreated back into formality. These moments were worse than his consistent coldness would have been, because they showed me what I could never have, the real Alexander, unguarded and human, rather than the automaton of duty who shared my days. But it was the small kindnesses that truly undid me, kindnesses he never acknowledged, never took credit for, but which I knew came from him. The library began acquiring books I had mentioned wanting to read, volumes that appeared on my favorite reading chair as if by magic. When I expressed a casual preference for chocolate over tea at breakfast, chocolate appeared the next morning and every morning thereafter. The pianoforte in the music room, which I had been told was out of tune and awaiting repair, was suddenly restored to perfect condition the day after Alexander overheard me mentioning to Lady Beatrice that I missed playing. He said nothing about any of it. If I thanked him, he deflected or denied responsibility, attributing everything to the efficient household staff. But I knew. I saw the way he would glance at me when he thought I was not looking, a fleeting softness in his eyes that vanished the moment I met his gaze. It was maddening, confusing, and dangerous to the careful walls I was building around my own heart. The anniversary of my father's death arrived like a punch to the stomach. I had been so consumed with the strangeness of my new life that I had almost forgotten. Almost, but not quite. The date loomed in my mind, bringing with it a wave of grief I had thought I had processed years ago. Apparently, one never truly finishes mourning. I escaped to the gardens that afternoon, seeking solitude in the bare November landscape. The roses had long since lost their blooms, leaving only thorny stems and dead leaves. It seemed appropriate somehow, this garden in mourning. I sat on a stone bench near the fountain, now silent for winter, and allowed myself to cry for my father, for his failures and his love, for the life we had lost, and the man he might have been, if only he had made different choices. I did not hear Alexander approach. I did not know he was there until he sat down beside me on the bench, saying nothing, simply present. We sat in silence for what might have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose meaning in that gray afternoon. His proximity was oddly comforting, even though we did not touch, even though he offered no words of consolation. Finally, when my tears had subsided, he spoke. My father died when I was 15. I thought I would never stop missing him. He paused, staring at the dormant garden. I was wrong. The missing never stops. It simply changes shape, becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to me, this small offering of shared grief. I wanted to reach for his hand, to thank him for understanding, for not offering empty platitudes or awkward sympathy, but I did not dare. We had boundaries, invisible but rigid, and crossing them would only make everything more complicated. "Thank you," I said instead, "for sitting with me." He nodded once, then rose and walked back toward the house, leaving me alone with the ghosts of the garden and a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold afternoon air. That night at dinner, I found the courage to break our usual pattern of safe, meaningless conversation. "May I ask you something?" I said, setting down my wine glass with slightly more force than intended. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features. "Of course. Why did you really choose me? Not the reasons you gave about strength and practicality, but the true reason. There had to be easier solutions to your problem." For a long moment, I thought he would retreat behind his usual defenses, offer some deflection or polite non-answer, but something in my tone, or perhaps in his own weariness with our charade, made him choose honesty instead. "Because," he said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will, "when I saw you at that ball, being humiliated by that vapid creature, I saw someone who deserved better than what life had given her. I saw someone who had been dealt a terrible hand and was playing it with more grace than I had managed with every advantage in my favor." He met my eyes, and the intensity there stole my breath. "And I suppose in some selfish way, I wanted to be the one to give you better, even if I could not give you everything." The unspoken words hung between us. "Even if I could not give you love. That is not nothing," I said softly. "What you have given me. It feels like nothing," he replied, his voice rough. "It feels like the bare minimum that any decent person would offer. You deserve so much more, Arabella." It was the first time he had used my name since our wedding day. The sound of it on his lips sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "We both deserve more," I said, surprised by my own boldness. "But perhaps what we have is enough. Perhaps we can make it enough." He looked at me with something that might have been hope or might have been despair. I could not tell which. Then he rose from the table with his usual abruptness. "I have work to attend to. Good night, Your Grace." Back to formality, back to safety. I watched him leave, feeling the familiar ache of disappointment and the new, dangerous flutter of something else, something I absolutely could not afford to feel. I was developing feelings for my husband, real feelings that went far beyond gratitude or respect, and that was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Alexander had been brutally clear about the terms of our arrangement. He had loved his first wife completely, and when she died, his capacity for romantic love had died with her. I was his convenient solution, his practical choice, his respected companion, but never, ever his beloved. Falling in love with him would be the height of foolishness. It would mean a lifetime of unrequited longing, of always being second best to a ghost, of loving someone who would never love me back. But the heart, I was discovering, did not particularly care about practical considerations or self-preservation. It wanted what it wanted, regardless of wisdom or consequence. I retired to my apartments that night and stood at the window overlooking the garden where Alexander had sat with me in my grief. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light over the dormant landscape. Somewhere in this vast house, my husband was probably still in his study, burying himself in work to avoid the messiness of human connection. And I was here, in my beautiful rooms, trying desperately to convince myself that respect and security were enough, that I did not need or want his love, that I could be content with the scraps of affection he unconsciously offered. I was lying to myself. I had been lying to myself since the day I accepted his proposal. I had told myself it was pragmatism, survival, a sensible choice given my circumstances. But the truth, the terrible truth I was only now beginning to acknowledge, was that even then, even in that first meeting, I had been drawn to him, to his pain that mirrored my own, to the strength it took to carry on despite that pain, to the fundamental decency that made him want to help someone he barely knew. I had married him for practical reasons, but I was falling in love with him for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality, and everything to do with the man he tried so hard to hide beneath layers of duty and control. This was going to hurt. I knew it with the certainty of prophecy. This was going to break my heart in ways that poverty and humiliation never had, because at least when I had nothing, I had hope. Now I had everything, except the one thing I was beginning to realize I wanted most, Alexander's heart. And that, he had made clear, was buried with his first wife, beyond resurrection, beyond reach. I turned from the window and prepared for bed, lying alone in my enormous bed in my elegant room in my beautiful cage. Outside, an owl called mournfully in the garden. Inside, I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember all the reasons why I should guard my heart, protect myself, maintain the careful distance our arrangement required. By morning, I would succeed in rebuilding those walls. I would smile at breakfast and ask polite questions and pretend that I was content with our sterile coexistence. But tonight, for just a few hours, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my impossible situation. I was married to a man I was falling in love with, who would never love me back. I had security and position and respect, and I had never felt more alone in my life. The tragedy of it would have made a good Gothic novel. I should write to the authors I loved and suggest the plot. The Duchess who married for convenience and lost her heart. Instead, they would probably tell me the ending was too sad, too hopeless, not enough of a happy resolution for their readers. If only they knew. If only I had known, when I accepted Alexander's cold proposal, that the real danger was not the loveless marriage I was agreeing to. It was the possibility, the terrible, wonderful possibility, that I might come to love my husband anyway, regardless of whether he could ever love me back. Winter settled over London with a vengeance, bringing with it the height of the social season, and the inevitable moment when Alexander and I would have to present ourselves as a proper couple to the highest echelons of society. The royal ball at Carlton House was the most prestigious event of the season, hosted by the Prince Regent himself, and our attendance was not merely expected, but required given Alexander's position in Parliament and his family's long-standing connection to the crown. I was terrified. Oh, I hid it well behind the serene mask I had perfected over months of playing the role of Duchess. I allowed my new lady's maid, Marie, to dress me in a gown of midnight blue silk that cost more than my father had lost in his worst gambling debts. I sat patiently while she arranged my hair in an elaborate style studded with sapphires that had belonged to Alexander's mother. I practiced my curtsy to the Prince Regent until my knees ached and my back protested. But inside, I was that same frightened girl who had been humiliated at the Pembroke ball, certain that at any moment someone would point out that I did not belong, that I was playing dress-up in borrowed finery, that beneath the silk and jewels I was still just poor, pathetic Arabella Thornfield. Alexander found me in the drawing room an hour before we were to depart, standing frozen before the mirror, my hands clenched so tightly that my nails bit into my palms. "You look beautiful," he said quietly from the doorway. I met his eyes in the mirror's reflection. I look like an imposter. He crossed the room to stand behind me, and for a moment I thought he might touch me, place a reassuring hand on my shoulder, perhaps, or offer some physical comfort. But his hands remained at his sides, proper and distant as always. "You are the Duchess of Winterbourne," he said with quiet intensity. "You have every right to be at that ball, every right to hold your head high, more right than half the people who will be there, whose only claim to distinction is an accident of birth." "And what is my claim?" I asked bitterly. "That I had the good fortune to catch the attention of a duke who needed a convenient wife." Something flashed in his eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or anger. "Your claim is that you survived circumstances that would have broken most people, that you maintained your dignity and grace when others would have surrendered to bitterness or despair, that you are intelligent, well-read, and perfectly capable of conversing with anyone in that ballroom, from the Prince Regent down to the lowest baron." His words startled me. I had grown so accustomed to his polite distance that this sudden passion caught me completely off guard. Before I could respond, he continued, his voice softer now. "I know what they will say about you, about us, that I married beneath me, that you trapped me somehow, that our union is scandalous or suspicious. Let them talk. Their opinions change nothing. You are my wife, my duchess, and anyone who treats you with anything less than the utmost respect will answer to me." There was something almost fierce in his tone, a protectiveness that made my heart stutter in my chest. This was not the cool, controlled man I had married. This was someone who actually cared what happened to me, who was prepared to defend me against the very society he had been born into. "Thank you," I managed, my voice embarrassingly unsteady. "That means more than you know." He nodded once, stepping back to a more proper distance, that familiar wall sliding back into place between us. But I had seen behind it, if only for a moment, and what I had glimpsed there gave me courage I had not known I possessed. The ball was every bit as magnificent and intimidating as I had feared. Carlton House glittered with thousands of candles, their light reflecting off mirrors and crystal, until the entire space seemed to glow. Ladies in gowns worth fortunes promenaded on the arms of gentlemen in perfectly tailored evening dress. Jewels that could have fed families for years adorned throats and wrists in elaborate coiffures. It was a display of wealth and power so ostentatious that it bordered on obscene. And I, Arabella Thornfield, who had once darned her own stockings and turned her dresses to make them last another season, was expected to move through this world as if I belonged. Alexander kept me close as we navigated the crush of people, his hand a steady presence at the small of my back, a touch that was proper, necessary even, but which sent awareness skittering along my spine nonetheless. We were greeted by dozens of people, nobles whose names I struggled to remember, politicians who wanted Alexander's ear on various issues, ladies who assessed me with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. I smiled and curtsied and said all the correct things, playing my role perfectly. But beneath the performance, anxiety built with each interaction. Each moment I waited for someone to expose me as a fraud. The presentation to the Prince Regent was the pinnacle of the evening's challenges. We waited in a long line of distinguished guests, each couple approaching the dais where His Royal Highness held court, making their bows and exchanging a few words before being dismissed. I watched the couples ahead of us, trying to memorize the precise depth of curtsy required, the proper forms of address, the delicate balance between deference and dignity. My mind was so full of protocol that when our turn finally came, when I sank into my curtsy before the man who would one day be king, I found myself rising to face him with my thoughts in complete disarray. The Prince Regent was older than I had expected, his face showing the effects of his notoriously excessive lifestyle, but his eyes were kind as they settled on me, and his smile seemed genuine rather than merely polite. "Your Grace," he addressed Alexander with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "So this is your new duchess. The ton has been abuzz with speculation about your unexpected marriage. "Indeed, Your Highness," Alexander replied smoothly. "May I present my wife, Arabella, Duchess of Winterbourne?" "Charming," the Prince Regent said, his gaze sharp despite his jovial manner. "Tell me, Your Grace, what do you think of the current situation with the American trade negotiations?" My mind went blank. Completely, utterly blank. Ladies, particularly new duchesses being presented at court for the first time, were not supposed to have opinions on political matters. We were supposed to smile and demur and leave such weighty topics to our husbands. The question was clearly a test, and I was failing it spectacularly. In my panic, instead of offering some graceful deflection, I blurted out the first thought that came to my mind. "I think, Your Highness, that if we continue to impose such restrictive tariffs, we will push the Americans into seeking alternative trading partners, which would be detrimental to both our nations in the long term." The silence that followed was absolute. I felt Alexander tense beside me, felt the weight of every aristocratic eye in the vicinity turning toward us. I had just committed a massive breach of protocol, offering a political opinion in the most inappropriate setting possible, contradicting the Prince Regent's own policies in the process. I was going to be sick. I was going to faint. I was going to disgrace Alexander and myself, and prove that I truly did not belong in this world. And then the Prince Regent laughed. A genuine, delighted laugh that broke the tension like shattering glass. "By God, Winterbourne, your Duchess has a mind of her own. How refreshing after all these simpering creatures who cannot string 3 words together." He turned back to me with obvious interest. "And what, pray tell, would you propose as an alternative to our current tariff structure?" I glanced desperately at Alexander, expecting to see anger or mortification. Instead, I found him watching me with an expression I had never seen before. Pride, unmistakable and warm, softening the usual severity of his features. He caught my eye and gave the slightest nod, as if to say, "Go on." So I did. Trembling but determined, I outlined a modified tariff proposal that I had read about in one of Alexander's discarded copies of the Times, tempering my argument with careful deference to His Highness's superior wisdom and experience. It was a delicate dance, offering an opinion while making it clear I was not challenging his authority. By some miracle, I managed it. The Prince Regent seemed genuinely engaged, asking follow-up questions that I answered as best I could, while Alexander interjected occasionally to guide the conversation back to safer ground whenever I ventured too far into controversial territory. When we were finally dismissed, with the Prince Regent's assurance that he found me utterly delightful and surprisingly well-informed, I was shaking so badly that I feared my legs would not carry me away from the dais. Alexander's hand at my back steadied me, his touch firmer now, almost possessive. He guided me through the crowd to a relatively quiet corner, shielded from view by a decorative arrangement of palms. "I am so sorry," I began immediately, the words tumbling over each other. "I know I should not have said anything, should have demurred or—" "You were magnificent," he interrupted, his voice low and intense. "Absolutely magnificent." I stared at him, certain I had misheard, but I broke protocol. I offered political opinions when I should have remained silent. "I embarrassed you. You impressed the Prince Regent, which is considerably more difficult than embarrassing me." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. A real smile, not the polite expression he offered in public. "Do you know how rare it is for him to engage in actual substantive conversation at these events? He spends most of his time suffering through platitudes and flattery. You gave him something interesting to think about." I was terrified, I admitted. My mind went completely blank, and then I just spoke without thinking. I noticed. His smile widened slightly. "Your face went absolutely white. I thought you might faint." I nearly did. I managed a weak laugh, the tension finally draining from my shoulders. I still might, to be honest. His hand moved from my back to my elbow, a gentle touch that somehow felt more intimate than anything we had shared before. "Breathe, Arabella. The worst is over. You survived your presentation to the Prince Regent, and not only survived but impressed him. Everything else tonight will be simple by comparison." He was right, though I would not have believed it in that moment. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and conversations, none quite as nerve-wracking as that initial presentation. And throughout it all, Alexander remained close, his presence a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of the ball. But something had changed between us. I felt it in the way he looked at me when he thought I was not paying attention, in the way his hand lingered a moment too long when he passed me a glass of champagne, in the warmth of his voice when he introduced me to yet another dignitary. The walls he had built so carefully were cracking, and I did not think he even realized it. We left the ball near midnight, settling into the carriage for the ride back to Mayfair. The interior was dark and private, lit only by the passing street lamps that sent shadows dancing across Alexander's face. I expected him to retreat into his usual silence, but instead he turned to me with an expression I could not quite decipher. "I must tell you something," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Something I should have said before, but could not find the words. My heart began to race, though I could not have said why. "Yes, when I asked you to marry me, I told you it was purely a practical arrangement, that I needed a wife who would fulfill certain duties without expecting emotional attachment." He paused, his jaw tightening. I believed that was true. I convinced myself that I was capable of maintaining that distance, that my heart was safely buried and could not be touched. I held my breath, afraid to move, afraid to hope. "I was wrong," he continued, and now he was looking directly at me, his gray eyes catching the lamplight. "I have tried, Arabella. God knows I have tried to maintain the boundaries I set, but every day you make it more difficult. Every small smile, every intelligent observation, every moment of grace and strength, you are dismantling every defense I built, brick by careful brick." His hand moved, and suddenly it was covering mine where it rested on the seat between us. The warmth of his palm against my glove sent electricity coursing through me. "Tonight, when I saw you standing before the Prince Regent, terrified but refusing to show it, speaking your mind despite your fear, I have never been more proud of anyone in my life, and I realized that somewhere along the way, without my permission or intent, you have become—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "You have become important to me, more than important, essential, essential." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Not love. He had not said love, but something real, something that made my heart hammer against my ribs and my breath catch in my throat. "Alexander," I whispered, his name strange and wonderful on my lips. "What are you saying?" "I am saying—" He stopped again, and I saw the conflict warring in his expression, the desire to speak warring with the instinct to protect himself. "I am saying that our arrangement may not remain as simple as I promised it would be, that I may not be able to offer you the emotional distance I guaranteed, and I do not know if that is fair to you or what it means for us, but I needed you to know. I needed you to understand that when I look at you now, I do not see a convenient solution or a practical choice. I see my wife, and that matters more than I ever imagined it would." Before I could respond, before I could tell him that his words were everything I had been afraid to hope for, the carriage lurched to a stop. We had arrived home. The moment shattered as a footman opened the door, and Alexander withdrew his hand, his expression closing once more into the familiar mask of composure. But as he helped me down from the carriage, as we entered the house and began the nightly ritual of retiring to our separate apartments, I caught the look he gave me, longing mixed with fear, desire tempered by doubt, and I understood, with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying, that Alexander Ashford was not nearly as immune to me as he had claimed to be. He was falling. Perhaps not into love, not yet, but into something that might one day become love if we were brave enough to let it. "Good night, Arabella," he said at my door, and this time when he spoke my name, it sounded like a caress. "Good night, Alexander," I replied, and watched him walk away down the corridor, his shoulders tense with the weight of everything he had almost said. I entered my apartments and stood in the darkness for a long moment, my hand pressed against my chest, where my heart was beating far too fast. Everything had changed tonight. The careful boundaries of our arrangement had been crossed, and there was no going back to the safe distance we had maintained. I was no longer just grateful to him, or fond of him, or whatever careful emotion I had been allowing myself to feel. I was deeply, desperately, utterly in love with my husband, and he had admitted that I mattered to him, that I had become essential. Not love, perhaps, but the possibility of love. The beginning of something that might grow into the genuine partnership I had given up hope of ever having. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. And it was completely, utterly beyond my control. I had spent months trying to guard my heart, trying to maintain the emotional distance our arrangement required. But tonight, in that carriage, holding his hand in the darkness, I had finally acknowledged the truth I had been denying since the day I accepted his proposal. I loved him. I loved Alexander Ashford with an intensity that frightened me, that made me vulnerable in ways I had sworn never to be vulnerable again. And the most terrifying part was that he seemed to be developing feelings for me as well, feelings he did not understand, could not name, but which were clearly disrupting the careful control he maintained over his life. We were walking towards something together, neither of us quite sure where it would lead. But for the first time since our wedding day, I felt hope unfurling in my chest like a flower reaching toward sunlight. Perhaps our marriage would not remain the cold arrangement we had both agreed to. Perhaps there was space for warmth, for genuine affection, for something that looked remarkably like love, even if neither of us dared speak its name. Or perhaps I was deluding myself, reading too much into a few kind words and a moment of connection in a dark carriage. Perhaps Alexander was simply being gentlemanly, acknowledging that we had developed a friendship of sorts. Nothing more. But I did not think so. I had seen the look in his eyes, felt the tremor in his hand when it covered mine. Whatever was happening between us, it was real and powerful, and utterly beyond the bounds of our original agreement. The question now was whether we would have the courage to pursue it, to risk the safety of our careful arrangement for the possibility of something more, whether Alexander could let go of his first wife's ghost and allow himself to love again, whether I could trust him with my heart, knowing it might be broken. I did not have answers to any of these questions. All I knew was that everything had changed tonight, and there would be no returning to the comfortable distance we had maintained. We were at a crossroads, Alexander and I, and the path we chose would determine whether our marriage remained a convenient fiction or became something far more dangerous and far more wonderful. The days following the royal ball passed in a strange, suspended tension. Alexander and I moved around each other like dancers learning a new choreography, uncertain of the steps, but aware that something fundamental had shifted. Our breakfast conversations grew longer, less constrained by formality. He began asking my opinion on political matters he was considering, genuinely listening to my responses rather than simply tolerating them. And I found myself sharing more of my thoughts, my observations, the parts of myself I had kept carefully hidden. We were becoming friends, I realized, or perhaps something more than friends, though neither of us dared name it. But for every moment of connection, there were still walls between us. Alexander would catch himself growing too familiar, too warm, and retreat back into formality. I would feel the impulse to reach for his hand, to close the physical distance that still separated us, and stop myself, remembering the terms of our arrangement. We were circling each other, drawn together but afraid to take the final step. It was Lady Beatrice who finally forced the issue, though I doubt even she realized what she was setting in motion. She arrived for tea one Wednesday afternoon, sweeping into my sitting room with her usual imperious air and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I had been expecting a pleasant, if somewhat acerbic, visit. Lady Beatrice had maintained her role as my occasional companion and confidant, even after my marriage to her nephew. What I was not expecting was for her to settle into her chair, accept her tea, and then proceed to demolish every assumption I had made about my marriage. "You are in love with him," she said, without preamble, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. I nearly dropped my teacup. "I beg your pardon? Do not insult my intelligence by denying it, child. I have been observing you for months now, watching the way you look at Alexander when you think no one is paying attention. You have that particular misery about you that comes from loving someone who has not yet realized they love you back." Heat flooded my face. "Lady Beatrice, I hardly think—" "And he loves you as well, the stubborn fool, though he is working very hard to convince himself otherwise." My heart stuttered in my chest. "That is not possible. Alexander was very clear about the terms of our arrangement. He does not. He cannot." "Cannot?" Lady Beatrice's eyebrow rose in that particular way that had always made me feel as though I were being examined by a particularly astute physician. "Or will not. There is a significant difference. He told me his heart was buried with his first wife," I said, the words tasting bitter even as I spoke them, "that he would never love again." Lady Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentler than I had ever heard it. "Alexander's first wife was named Catherine. Did he tell you about her? No, I admitted. He has never spoken of her to me. I thought not. She sighed, setting down her teacup with uncharacteristic care. What I am about to tell you, Arabella, Alexander has never shared with anyone outside the immediate family, but I believe you have a right to know, especially given how things stand between you now. A chill ran down my spine. Perhaps you should not. Catherine was beautiful, Lady Beatrice interrupted, and sweet-natured, and entirely wrong for my nephew. Oh, I know how that sounds. Cruel and judgmental. But it is the truth, nonetheless. Alexander married her because it was expected, because she came from the right family and had the right connections, because it was his duty to produce an heir. He tried to love her. God knows he tried. But they were fundamentally incompatible. She wanted a husband who would shower her with romantic gestures and constant attention, and Alexander has never been capable of that sort of performative affection. I listened, frozen, as Lady Beatrice continued. They were married for 3 years, and for 3 years they both tried to be something they were not. Catherine grew increasingly unhappy, convinced that Alexander did not love her, which was true, though he cared for her and tried his best to make her comfortable. Alexander grew increasingly withdrawn, feeling like a failure as a husband, unable to give his wife what she needed. It was a tragedy of incompatibility, nothing more or less, but he grieved when she died. I said softly, I have seen the way he looks at her portrait. Of course he grieved. Lady Beatrice's voice was sharp now. He grieved for the woman who had tried to love him, for the failure of their marriage, for the child she carried when she fell ill, a son who died with her. But Arabella, he did not grieve for lost love. He grieved for lost possibility, for the family he would never have, for the guilt of feeling relieved alongside his sorrow. The words hit me like a physical blow. Relieved? That he would not have to continue pretending, Lady Beatrice said bluntly, that he was free of a marriage that had made them both miserable. And then, because he is Alexander, he punished himself for that relief by deciding he would never marry again, never risk making another woman unhappy, never allow himself to fail as a husband a second time. I struggled to process this information, this complete rewriting of the narrative I had constructed in my mind. But he told you what he believed to be true, Lady Beatrice interrupted, that his heart was dead, that he could not love. But Arabella, the heart he thinks is buried never truly existed. He never loved Catherine. He wanted to, tried desperately to, but he simply could not. And so he convinced himself that he had loved and lost, rather than admitting the more painful truth, that he had failed to love at all. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. But you, child, you are different. I have watched my nephew over these months since your marriage. I have seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. I have heard the warmth in his voice when he speaks your name. I have observed how he ensures your favorite books appear in the library, how he arranges his schedule to maximize the time you spend together, how he defends you with a ferocity he never showed for Catherine. Those are just kindnesses, I whispered, though my heart was racing. Consideration for my comfort. They are the actions of a man falling in love, Lady Beatrice corrected firmly. A man who does not yet realize it, because he has convinced himself he is incapable of the emotion. But I have lived long enough to recognize love when I see it, even when the people involved are too stubborn or too frightened to acknowledge it themselves. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. Could it be true? Could Alexander's protestations about his buried heart be based on a fiction he had told himself to cope with guilt and failure? Could the walls he had built so carefully be protecting not a broken heart, but an empty space where love had never truly existed? Until now? What would you have me do with this information? I asked finally, my voice barely steady. Lady Beatrice smiled, a rare expression of genuine warmth. I would have you fight for him, Arabella. Fight for the possibility of real love, real partnership. Stop accepting the crumbs of affection he offers, and demand the whole feast. Make him acknowledge what he is feeling instead of hiding behind the excuse of his tragic past. And if I am wrong? The question came out small, frightened. If he truly cannot love me, if I push too hard and drive him away completely, then at least you will know, Lady Beatrice said pragmatically. At least you will have tried, rather than spending your life wondering what might have been if you had been brave enough to risk rejection. After she left, I sat alone in my sitting room for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to absorb everything I had learned. The narrative I had constructed about Alexander, the grieving widower, the man with a heart too broken to love again, crumbled like sand, revealing something far more complex and far more hopeful beneath. He had not loved Catherine. He had tried and failed, and convinced himself that the failure meant he was incapable of love. But what if Lady Beatrice was right? What if the feelings he was developing for me were genuine love, the real thing he had never experienced before, and he simply did not recognize it because it bore no resemblance to what he thought love should feel like? I needed to know. I needed to hear the truth from him, needed to understand what was real and what was fiction in the story we had been telling ourselves about our marriage. I found him in his study that evening, bent over papers that likely had something to do with estate management or parliamentary business. He looked up when I entered, surprise flickering across his features. I had never come to his study uninvited before, never breached this particular sanctuary. "Arabella," he said, rising from his chair. "Is something wrong?" "I spoke with Lady Beatrice today," I said, closing the door behind me, a breach of propriety that made his eyebrows rise. "She told me about Catherine." The color drained from his face. For a long moment, he simply stared at me, and I saw a dozen emotions flicker across his usually controlled features. Shock, anger, fear, and something that might have been relief. "She had no right," he said finally, his voice tight. "Perhaps not," I agreed, moving closer. "But I am glad she did, because now I need to hear the truth from you, Alexander. Not the story you have been telling yourself, but the real truth about your first marriage and what it means for us." He turned away from me, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "What did she tell you?" "That you never loved Catherine. That you tried, but could not. That the heart you claim is buried never truly existed." I took another step closer, close enough now to see the tension in his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on the desk. "Is it true?" The silence stretched between us, painful and heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." The single word seemed to cost him everything. His shoulders slumped, and I saw the careful facade he maintained crack completely. "I tried," he continued, still not looking at me. "God knows I tried. Catherine was everything a wife should be. Beautiful, accomplished, well-bred, and she wanted so desperately to be loved. But I could not give her what she needed. No matter how hard I tried, I could not make myself feel the grand passion she expected, the romantic devotion she deserved. I failed her in every way that mattered." "And when she died?" I asked softly. "I grieved," he said. "For her, for our son, for the failure of everything we had tried to build. But Arabella," his voice broke slightly, "I also felt relieved, and that made me a monster. What kind of man feels relief at his wife's death? What kind of man fails so completely to love someone who deserved so much better? A man who was honest enough to recognize incompatibility," I said, and he finally turned to face me, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "A man who tried his best in an impossible situation. A man who is human, Alexander, not a monster." "I convinced myself," he continued as if I had not spoken, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam, "that I was incapable of love. That whatever part of me should feel that emotion was simply missing. It was easier than admitting the truth, that I had never loved Catherine, that our marriage was a failure from the beginning, that I was fundamentally broken in some way that made me unable to give anyone what they needed. And so you proposed to me," I said, understanding dawning. "A marriage of convenience, where your inability to love would not matter, because love was never part of the agreement." "Yes." He looked at me with naked vulnerability I had never seen before. "I thought I could maintain the distance, could keep you at arm's length. I thought we could have a comfortable arrangement where neither of us expected more than courtesy and respect. It seemed," he laughed bitterly, "it seemed safe, but it did not work," I said, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. "No," he whispered, "it did not work, because you, Arabella, you are nothing like Catherine. You do not demand or expect or need grand gestures. You simply exist, with your intelligence and your strength and your quiet grace. And somehow, without my permission or intent, you have—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I have what? I prompted, taking another step closer. You have made me feel things I did not know I was capable of feeling, he said, and now his eyes were locked on mine, gray and storm-tossed and utterly sincere. Every day with you is a revelation. Every smile you give me feels like a gift. Every conversation we have leaves me wanting more, wanting to know everything about how your mind works, what makes you laugh, what brings you joy. And it terrifies me, Arabella, because I do not know what to call this feeling, this constant awareness of you, this need to see you happy and safe and loved. I finished for him, my voice trembling. He stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Is that what this is? He asked, wonder and fear mixing in his expression. This consuming need to be near you, to make you smile, to protect you from anything that might hurt you. This feeling that I am only half alive when you are not in the room? Is this love? Tears were streaming down my face now, though I could not have said when they started. Yes, Alexander, that is exactly what love is. But I do not know how to love, he said desperately. I failed at it once. I do not know how to give you what you need, what you deserve. I will only fail you as I failed Catherine. You could never fail me, I said, closing the remaining distance between us. Because what I need is not grand gestures or constant declarations. What I need is exactly what you have been giving me all along. Your respect, your consideration, your presence, the books in the library, the chocolate at breakfast, the way you defended me at the royal ball, the way you sit with me in my grief without demanding that I explain or justify. That is love, Alexander. The quiet, constant, everyday kind of love that does not announce itself with fanfare, but simply exists, reliable and true. He reached up with a trembling hand to touch my face, his thumb brushing away my tears with infinite gentleness. I am falling in love with you, he said, as if testing the words for the first time. No, that is not accurate. I have fallen. I am already completely, hopelessly in love with my wife, and I have no idea what to do with this feeling. You could start, I said, my voice breaking with joy and relief and overwhelming emotion, by kissing me. Properly, Alexander. Not the polite peck you gave me at our wedding, but a real kiss. The kind that says you mean every word you just spoke. For a moment, he simply stared at me, and I feared I had pushed too far, asked for too much. But then he smiled, a real unguarded smile that transformed his entire face, and pulled me into his arms. The kiss was nothing like the chaste touch of lips at our wedding. It was desperate and searching, full of months of suppressed longing and newfound hope. His arms wrapped around me as if he feared I might disappear, and I clung to him with equal fervor, both of us trying to communicate through touch what words had failed to express. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. I love you, he said, and the words were unsteady but absolutely sincere. I do not know how to do this properly, how to be the romantic hero you deserve, but I love you, Arabella, more than I thought myself capable of loving anyone. I love you too, I whispered back. I have loved you for months, though I tried desperately not to. I thought you could never return my feelings, that I was doomed to a lifetime of loving someone who would never love me back. Never, he said fiercely, pulling me closer. I may not know all the right words or gestures, but I swear to you, Arabella, I will spend the rest of my life trying to show you how completely, how devastatingly you have captured my heart. We stood there in his study, holding each other as if the world might end if we let go, and I felt something settle in my chest. A rightness, a sense of finally coming home after a long journey through uncertain territory. Our marriage had begun as a transaction, a cold arrangement meant to benefit us both, without requiring any genuine emotion. But somehow, despite our best efforts to maintain distance, despite our fears and our walls and our determination to protect our wounded hearts, we had found something neither of us had been looking for. We had found real love, the messy, complicated, utterly human kind of love that does not follow rules or respect boundaries or care about propriety. The kind of love that grows quietly in the spaces between words, in small gestures and shared silences, in the gradual understanding that the person beside you has become essential to your existence. I had been humiliated for being poor, had accepted a marriage of convenience to escape my circumstances, but in doing so, I had found something far more valuable than wealth or position. I had found a man who loved me not despite my past, but because of it, who valued my strength because he understood what it had cost me to maintain it, who looked at me and saw not a convenient solution, but the other half of his soul. And he, who had thought himself incapable of love, who had buried himself in duty and distance to avoid the pain of his own perceived inadequacy, had discovered that love was possible after all, when it was real, when it was right, when it was with someone who understood that love does not require perfection, only presence. We still had challenges ahead of us, I knew, learning to be truly vulnerable with each other, navigating the reality of a genuine marriage after months of careful distance, healing the wounds we both carried. But for the first time since our wedding day, I felt hope, real, solid, unshakable hope that we could build something beautiful together. "Stay with me tonight," Alexander said softly, his arms still around me, not in separate apartments maintaining proper distance, but here, with me. "Let us begin as we mean to continue, together." "Yes," I said simply, and felt his arms tighten around me in response. We had a lifetime ahead of us to learn how to love each other properly, but in that moment, in his study with the fire burning low and the world locked out, we had everything we needed: honesty, hope, and each other. The rest would come with time. The weeks following our confession transformed our marriage in ways both profound and subtle. Alexander and I no longer maintained separate apartments, a scandal that would have rocked society had anyone outside our household known, though of course no one did. We learned each other slowly, carefully, like cartographers mapping new territory. I discovered that he was surprisingly playful in private, that he had a dry wit that made me laugh until I could barely breathe, that he liked to read poetry aloud in the evenings, though he would die before admitting it to anyone else. And he learned me, my preference for chocolate over tea, the way I hummed when I was concentrating on a book, how I needed silence in the mornings before I could face conversation. We were building something real, something that bore no resemblance to the cold arrangement we had initially agreed upon. It was, quite simply, the happiest I had ever been in my life. But happiness, I was learning, made one vulnerable in new and terrifying ways. When you had nothing to lose. When you had everything, the fear of losing it became a constant shadow. That shadow took the form of Lady Constance Fairfax. I should have known she would not simply disappear from my life, that my elevation to Duchess would only fuel her spite rather than quench it. But I had been so consumed with my own transformation, with learning to be Alexander's true wife, rather than his convenient arrangement, that I had forgotten the existence of enemies I had made in my previous life. The summons to court arrived on a cold February morning. The Prince Regent was hosting a formal audience, and our attendance was not requested but required. Alexander had business to discuss with His Highness regarding certain parliamentary matters, and I would be expected to attend as his Duchess, to stand with the other noble wives while our husbands conducted the realm's business. I should have been confident. After all, I had survived my presentation at the royal ball, had even impressed the Prince Regent with my political acumen, but something about the formality of this occasion, the weight of protocol and tradition, made me uneasy in a way I could not quite articulate. Alexander noticed my tension as we prepared to leave. He came up behind me as I stood before the mirror in my dressing room, his hands settling on my shoulders with familiar warmth. "You are worried," he observed, meeting my eyes in the reflection. "I do not know why," I admitted. "Perhaps it is simply the formality of it all. Court protocol is so much more rigid than a ball." His hands tightened slightly on my shoulders. "You will be magnificent, as you always are, and I will be right there with you." But he would not be. Not really. Once we arrived, propriety would separate us. He to conduct his business with the Prince Regent and other members of Parliament, I to wait in the antechamber with the other wives, making polite conversation and pretending that we were content with our ornamental role in the proceedings. The court was even more intimidating than I remembered from the ball. Carlton House in full formal dress was a study in intimidation. Guards in elaborate livery, courtiers in their most magnificent attire, an atmosphere of such rigid formality that even breathing felt like it might constitute a breach of protocol. Alexander and I arrived together, but were separated almost immediately. He squeezed my hand once, a gesture hidden by the folds of my gown, and then was swept away into the inner chambers where the Prince Regent conducted his business. I was directed to the antechamber, a smaller but no less magnificent room, where perhaps 24 noble ladies waited in various states of boredom and barely concealed irritation at being excluded from the real business of the day. I recognized several faces from various social events. Lady Pemberton, who gave me a warm smile, Lady Ashworth, who nodded politely, and there, holding court in the center of a small group of admirers, Lady Constance Fairfax. She looked even more beautiful than I remembered, dressed in a gown of pale pink that must have cost a fortune, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that showcased a diamond necklace worthy of royalty. When she saw me enter, something flickered in her eyes: recognition, calculation, and unmistakable malice. I had hoped she might have forgotten our previous encounters, might have moved on to tormenting some other unfortunate target, but the smile that curved her lips as our eyes met told me I had been foolish to hope for such mercy. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, drawing every eye to us. "How delightful to see you. I do hope you have been well since your rather dramatic entrance into society." The emphasis on dramatic was subtle, but unmistakable. Several ladies tittered behind their fans, and I felt the familiar heat of humiliation beginning to creep up my neck. But I was no longer the powerless companion I had been at the Pembroke ball. I was the Duchess of Winterbourne, and I would not be cowed. "Quite well, Lady Constance," I replied with perfect courtesy. "And you? I trust you have been keeping yourself occupied." It was a mild riposte, almost genteel, but her eyes narrowed fractionally. She did not like being challenged, even in such a subtle way. "Oh, I keep myself very occupied," she said, her tone sweet as poisoned honey. "In fact, I have been quite fascinated by the story of your marriage. So sudden, so unexpected. One might almost say, suspicious." The room had gone very quiet. Every woman present was now watching our exchange with rapt attention, sensing drama in the making. "Suspicious?" I repeated, keeping my voice level. "I am afraid I do not take your meaning." "Well," Lady Constance said, moving closer with the grace of a predator circling wounded prey, "it is simply that the circumstances are so unusual. A Duke of Winterbourne's standing, marrying a woman with no fortune, no connections, no particular advantages. One cannot help but wonder what inducement could have led to such an unlikely match." The implication was clear, though carefully worded to avoid direct accusation. She was suggesting that I had somehow trapped or manipulated Alexander, that our marriage was not legitimate in some fundamental way. "Perhaps," I said, my voice cold now. "The Duke simply recognized qualities that go beyond fortune or connections. Qualities like character, intelligence, and genuine feeling, things that cannot be purchased or inherited." "How philosophical," Lady Constance said, and now her mask of sweetness was slipping, revealing the venom beneath. "But we all know that marriages among our class are not about such romantic notions. They are about alliances, about preserving and advancing family interests. Your marriage serves no such purpose. It benefits you enormously while offering the Duke nothing he could not have obtained elsewhere with far more advantage." "You presume to know what my husband values," I said, my anger finally breaking through my careful control. "You presume to judge a marriage you know nothing about." "I know," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the now silent room, "that you were Lady Beatrice's companion, a paid servant, dependent on her charity, and now, mere months later, you are a duchess. It is the stuff of fairy tales, is it not? One might even say, too convenient to be believed." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone present. She was suggesting fraud, deception, that I had somehow manipulated my way into a position I did not deserve and could not possibly merit. I should have walked away, should have maintained my dignity, and refused to engage further. But something in me, that same stubborn pride that had sustained me through poverty and humiliation, refused to let her slander go unanswered. "My marriage," I said clearly, ensuring that every woman in the room could hear, "is based on genuine affection and mutual respect. Something I suspect you know nothing about, given that you seem to spend your days manufacturing drama rather than cultivating any relationships of substance." It was a direct hit, and I saw it land. Lady Constance's face flushed with genuine anger, all pretense of sweetness vanishing. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You, who have no right to the title you wear, who has contributed nothing to society but the spectacle of your own social climbing. That is enough." The voice that cut through Lady Constance's tirade was not mine. It was not even one of the other ladies attempting to restore order. It was deeper, male, and absolutely glacial with fury. Alexander stood in the doorway of the antechamber, and I had never seen him look so dangerously angry. His usual control had fractured completely, replaced by something that made even Lady Constance take a step backward. "Your Grace," Lady Constance said, her voice suddenly uncertain. "You were merely slandering my wife," Alexander said, his voice quiet but carrying with perfect clarity. "In a formal court setting, before witnesses, you have publicly questioned the legitimacy of our marriage and impugned my Duchess's character. Do you realize the gravity of what you have done?" Behind him, I could see other members of Parliament emerging from the inner chambers, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Lord Fairfax, Lady Constance's father, his face pale with what looked like genuine horror. "Constance," Lord Fairfax said sharply, "what have you done?" But Alexander was not finished. He moved into the room with deliberate purpose, and I saw something in his expression that took my breath away, not just anger, but determination. He was going to do something dramatic, something public, and I had no idea what it might be. He stopped directly in front of Lady Constance, and in the silence that followed, I swear I could hear every heartbeat in that room. "You question why I married Arabella Thornfield," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the antechamber and likely beyond, into the inner chambers where the Prince Regent himself might be listening. "You suggest that she lacks the qualities necessary to be my Duchess. You imply fraud and deception. Very well. Let me clarify the matter for you and for anyone else who shares your confusion." Then, before I could process what was happening, before anyone could intervene or protest, Alexander dropped to one knee before me. The shock of it rippled through the room like a physical wave. A duke did not kneel, not to anyone below the royal family, not in public, not ever. And yet there he was, Alexander Ashford, Duke of Winterbourne, on his knees before his wife in the antechamber of Carlton House, with half the nobility of England watching. "Arabella," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, but absolutely clear. "I married you because when I saw you at that ball, being humiliated by this creature," he gestured dismissively toward Lady Constance without taking his eyes from mine, "I saw more strength, more grace, more genuine worth in you than in any woman I have ever known. I saw someone who had lost everything and maintained her dignity. I saw someone with intelligence and compassion and a spirit that could not be broken by circumstances or cruelty." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I did not care who saw them. "I asked you to marry me," he continued, "because I recognized something I had been missing my entire life. A partner worthy of the name. Someone I could respect. Someone who would challenge me. Someone who would make me want to be better than I was. And you have exceeded every expectation, every hope I dared to hold." He reached up and took my hand, his thumb brushing across my knuckles with infinite tenderness. "But more than that," he said, and now his voice was breaking with the weight of everything he was revealing. "I love you. I love you with an intensity that terrifies me. I love your strength and your gentleness, your intelligence and your compassion, your pride and your vulnerability. I love the way you hum when you read, the way you challenge my assumptions, the way you make me laugh when I thought I had forgotten how. I love everything about you, and I would kneel before the entire world to make sure everyone understands that you are not a convenient choice or a strategic alliance. You are my wife, my Duchess, my beloved, and if anyone in this room or beyond questions your worth or your place at my side, they will answer to me." The silence that followed was absolute. I stood frozen, my hand in his, completely unable to speak or move or do anything but stare at this man who had just laid his heart bare before the highest society in England, who had knelt before me in the most public declaration of love imaginable. Then, from the doorway, came the sound of slow, measured applause. The Prince Regent himself stood there, having emerged from the inner chambers to witness the spectacle. His face was thoughtful, but there was something that might have been approval in his expression. "Well said, Winterbourne," the Prince Regent said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Very well said indeed. It seems we could all learn something about the true meaning of marriage from your example." He turned his gaze to Lady Constance, who looked as though she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. "Lady Constance, I believe you owe the Duchess of Winterbourne an apology." Lady Constance opened her mouth. But no sound emerged. She looked to her father, who simply shook his head, his disappointment evident. She started, then stopped. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I apologize, Your Grace. My words were inappropriate and unkind. I spoke from jealousy and spite, and I deeply regret causing you distress." It was not a gracious apology, but it was an apology nonetheless, made before witnesses and with the Prince Regent himself watching. It would be recorded, remembered, and Lady Constance's reputation would suffer far more from this incident than mine ever had from my poverty. Alexander rose from his knee, still holding my hand, and turned to face the Prince Regent. "Your Highness, I apologize for the disruption." "Nonsense," the Prince Regent interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "That was the most entertainment I have had at court in months. Far better than another tedious debate about tariffs." He smiled, and there was genuine warmth in it. Besides, it is refreshing to see genuine feeling in these halls. We could use more of it. He departed then, and slowly, the spell that had held the room frozen began to break. Ladies began to murmur to each other, some shooting sympathetic glances my way, others regarding Lady Constance with varying degrees of contempt. Lord Fairfax took his daughter's arm and practically dragged her from the room, her face burning with humiliation. Alexander turned back to me, his hand still holding mine, his eyes searching my face with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, as if we were not standing in a room full of witnesses to his extraordinary declaration. "You knelt," I said, my voice shaking, "in front of everyone. You knelt." "I would kneel before God himself if it meant protecting you from cruelty," he said simply. "I would do anything, sacrifice anything, to ensure the world understands what you mean to me." I laughed then, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. "Alexander, you have just made yourself the subject of gossip for the next decade. Every drawing room in London will be talking about the Duke who knelt before his wife." "Let them talk," he said, and there was something fierce and proud in his expression. "Let them see that I love my wife enough to cast aside pride and protocol. Let them understand that you are not some convenient arrangement, but the woman who has claimed my heart so completely that I would gladly humble myself before the entire world for her sake." Around us, the other ladies were beginning to approach, offering congratulations and sympathetic words, praising Alexander's devotion and expressing their own disapproval of Lady Constance's behavior. But I barely heard them. All I could see was Alexander, this man who had been so careful with his emotions, so controlled and guarded, who had just sacrificed his pride and his privacy for me. "I love you," I whispered, knowing he could hear me despite the growing noise around us. "I love you so much it frightens me." "Good," he said, a smile finally breaking through his serious expression, "because you are going to have to endure a lifetime of me being insufferably devoted to you. I hope you are prepared for that." "I think I can manage," I said, and then, shocking myself and probably half the ladies still watching, I pulled him down and kissed him right there in the antechamber of Carlton House. Propriety and protocol be damned. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless and grinning like fools, Lady Pemberton was laughing outright. "Well," she said, her voice full of delight, "I do believe the Winterbournes have set a new standard for romantic devotion. The rest of us shall have to work very hard to keep up." We left court that afternoon with our heads high and our hands linked, aware that we had just become either the greatest love story or the greatest scandal of the season. Possibly both. But I did not care. Let them talk. Let them gossip. Let them whisper about the Duke who loved his wife so much he would kneel before her in public, because I knew the truth. I knew that what we had built together, through misunderstanding and fear and careful hope, was real and solid and worth any amount of gossip or speculation. Alexander had offered me his name before the entire court. But more than that, he had offered me his heart, publicly and irrevocably. And in doing so, he had given me something far more valuable than any title or position. He had given me the certainty that I was loved, completely and without reservation, by the one person whose opinion truly mattered. That night, as we lay together in our shared bed, no more separate apartments, no more careful distance. He held me close and whispered against my hair. "I meant every word I said today, every single word." "I know," I whispered back, "and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of such devotion." "You already are," he said, his arms tightening around me. "You always have been. I was simply too blind to see it at first." "We were both blind," I said, "both so afraid of being hurt that we nearly missed the possibility of being happy. But we found it anyway," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Despite our best efforts to maintain distance, despite our fear and our walls, we found each other." "Yes," I agreed, feeling sleep beginning to claim me, safe and warm in his arms. "We did." And as I drifted off, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From humiliation to hope, from poverty to position, from loneliness to love. It had not been the path I would have chosen, had anyone asked me, but it had led me to exactly where I needed to be, in the arms of a man who loved me enough to kneel before the world, who saw in me not what I had lost, but what I had become through the losing, who valued my strength because he understood what it had cost me to maintain it. I had been humiliated for being poor, but in that humiliation, I had found something far more valuable than wealth. I had found love, true, genuine, soul-deep love that had transformed both of us into something better than we had been alone. And that, I thought as sleep finally claimed me, was worth any amount of suffering it had taken to reach this moment. Spring arrived in London with a gentle insistence, coaxing the first brave blooms from the earth and painting the world in shades of green and gold. It had been 3 months since that extraordinary day at court, 3 months since Alexander had knelt before me and declared his love to anyone who cared to listen. And they had all listened, every gossip, every society matron, every sharp-tongued critic who had once looked at me with disdain. The story had spread like wildfire through every drawing room in London. The Duke of Winterbourne kneeling before his wife. The public declaration of love that had silenced Lady Constance Fairfax and earned the approval of the Prince Regent himself. Some called it the greatest romance of the decade. Others whispered that it was merely an elaborate performance designed to silence criticism of our unlikely match. I did not care what they said. Let them speculate. Let them gossip. Let them analyze every word Alexander had spoken that day. I knew the truth. I had felt it in every touch, every glance, every moment we shared in the privacy of our home where no performance was necessary and only genuine feeling remained. Our marriage had transformed from that cold arrangement into something neither of us could have predicted, a partnership built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. We had learned each other's rhythms, our comfortable silences as precious as our animated conversations. Alexander no longer retreated to his study every evening. Instead, we spent our time together, reading by the fire, or simply talking about everything and nothing. I had discovered that my austere, controlled Duke had a playful side he showed only to me, a dry humor that caught me off guard and made me laugh until tears streamed down my face. And he had discovered that I was not as fragile as I appeared, that I could match his wit and challenge his assumptions and hold my own in debates about politics and philosophy. We were, quite simply, happy. A strange, unexpected happiness that felt all the more precious because neither of us had been looking for it when we found it. Lady Beatrice visited one afternoon in late April, sweeping into my sitting room with her usual imperious air, but with something softer in her eyes when she looked at me. "You are glowing," she announced without preamble, settling into her favorite chair. "Marriage to my nephew clearly agrees with you." "It does," I admitted, unable to suppress my smile. "More than I ever imagined it would." "I knew it would," she said with satisfaction. "From the moment he proposed that ridiculous arrangement, I knew it would end like this. You were always meant for each other. You stubborn fools simply needed time to realize it. You might have warned me," I said, pouring tea for both of us. "Saved me months of thinking I was falling in love with a man who could never love me back." "Where would be the fun in that?" Lady Beatrice replied, accepting her cup with a nod of thanks. "Besides, you both needed to discover it for yourselves. If I had told you, you would not have believed me. You had to live it, to experience the gradual transformation from strangers to partners to something more." She was right, of course. If someone had told me on my wedding day that I would come to love Alexander with such intensity, that he would come to love me with equal devotion, I would have thought them mad. The journey we had taken, from cold formality to genuine warmth, from careful distance to intimate connection, had been necessary. Every cautious step, every moment of uncertainty, had been building toward the certainty we now shared. "I heard an interesting piece of gossip yesterday," Lady Beatrice said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Lady Constance Fairfax has left London. Gone to stay with relatives in the country, apparently. Some say she will not return for the remainder of the season." I felt a flash of something that might have been sympathy. Lady Constance had been cruel, but her humiliation at court had been thorough and public. Her reputation had suffered far more from that single incident than mine had from all her previous attacks combined. "I take no pleasure in her downfall," I said quietly. "She acted from jealousy and spite, but I do not wish her genuine harm." "You are kinder than most would be," Lady Beatrice observed. "But then, that is one of the qualities my nephew loves most about you. Your capacity for compassion even toward those who have wronged you." After she left, I found myself wandering through the house, touching familiar objects, pausing at windows to look out at the gardens now bursting with spring growth. This home, which had felt so foreign and intimidating when I first arrived, had become truly mine. Not because of my title or position, but because it was filled with evidence of the life Alexander and I were building together. Books we had both read littered the library, marked with notes in both our handwriting. The music room held sheets for the duets we had begun playing together in the evenings. The gardens showed evidence of my influence, new roses planted according to my preferences, a bench positioned where I liked to sit in the morning sun. But more than the physical changes, the house felt different because it was filled with love. The servants had noticed it too, I think. The warmth that now permeated rooms that had once felt cold and formal. They smiled more readily, moved with less rigid formality, as if the happiness Alexander and I shared had permission to spread and touch everything around us. I found Alexander in his study, bent over correspondence as usual, but he looked up immediately when I entered and smiled. That particular smile he reserved only for me, the one that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish. "Come here," he said, pushing away from his desk and holding out his hand. I crossed to him and let him pull me into his lap, a position that would have scandalized me months ago, but now felt perfectly natural. He buried his face in my neck, breathing deeply. "You smell like the garden," he murmured against my skin. "Roses and sunshine." "I was walking," I said, running my fingers through his dark hair, thinking about how different everything is now, how different I am. He pulled back to look at me, his gray eyes searching my face. "Different how?" "Happy," I said simply. I do not think I understood what genuine happiness felt like until now. Even before my father's ruin, even when I had wealth and position, I was never truly happy. I was content, perhaps, or satisfied, but not this overwhelming sense of rightness, of being exactly where I am supposed to be, with exactly who I am supposed to be with. His hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb tracing my cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "I know exactly what you mean. I spent years thinking I was content with my life, my duties, my responsibilities, my carefully controlled existence. And then you arrived and showed me what I had been missing. You showed me that life could be more than duty and obligation, that it could be joy and laughter and connection. We saved each other," I said softly, in ways neither of us expected. "Yes," he agreed. "You saved me from a life of emotional isolation, and He paused, his expression growing serious. "I hope I saved you from the indignity and hardship you were enduring. But Arabella, I need you to understand something. What I gave you, the title, the security, the position, those things are meaningless compared to what you gave me. You gave me back my capacity to feel, to love, to be fully human, rather than just a collection of duties and obligations." Tears pricked at my eyes, though these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "How did we get so lucky?" I whispered. "How did two people entering a cold arrangement end up finding this?" "I do not know," he admitted, "but I thank God for it every day. Every single day, Arabella. I wake up grateful that you said yes to my proposal. Even knowing that I could not offer you love then, you took the risk. You gave me a chance I did not deserve. You deserved every chance," I said fiercely. "You deserved to be loved properly, completely, by someone who saw you for who you truly are, rather than what your title and position represent." He kissed me then, slow and deep, and I felt the now familiar flutter of desire mixed with tenderness. the heady combination that characterized our physical relationship. We had learned each other slowly, carefully, with a patience and consideration that made every touch feel precious. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "I have something I need to tell you," he said, and there was a note of nervousness in his voice that immediately caught my attention. "What is it?" "I have been thinking," he began, his hands settling on my waist as if to anchor himself, "about the future, about what we want from our lives together, beyond the social obligations and the duties we must fulfill." My heart began to race, though I could not have said why. "Go on." "When I married you, I told you that I needed an heir, that producing a child was one of the purposes of our arrangement." He paused, his eyes searching mine. "But Arabella, I do not want a child because duty demands it. I want a child because I want to create a family with you. I want to see your eyes in a small face, to hear your laugh echoed in a child's giggles. I want to watch you become a mother and know that any child of ours will grow up surrounded by the love we have found together." Joy bloomed in my chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Are you saying—" "I am saying that I want children with you, not because I must, but because I want to, because the thought of a little girl with your determination, or a little boy with your kindness, fills me with a happiness I cannot adequately express." He smiled, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "But only if you want it as well. Only if the idea brings you joy rather than fear or obligation." "I want it," I said immediately, my own eyes filling with tears. "I want everything with you, Alexander. Children, a future, a lifetime of mornings waking up beside you and evenings falling asleep in your arms. I want to build a family, to create something beautiful and lasting together." He kissed me again, and this time there was a promise in it, of the future we would create, of the children we would raise, of the love that would sustain us through whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, we hosted a small dinner party, just Lady Beatrice and a few close friends who had supported us through our unusual courtship and marriage. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the comfortable familiarity of people who genuinely cared for each other. At one point, I looked around the table and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it took my breath away. These people, Lady Beatrice with her sharp tongue and sharper insight, Lord and Lady Pemberton who had been kind when kindness was rare, even Alexander's friend Lord Ashworth who had defended me against gossip I had never heard. They had become my family in a way my blood relations had never been. And Alexander, sitting at the head of the table, catching my eye and smiling as if he knew exactly what I was thinking. He was my home. Not this house, not the title, not the wealth or position. Him, the man who had offered me a cold arrangement and ended up giving me his heart. After our guest departed, we stood together in the garden, looking up at the stars scattered across the night sky. The air was warm with the promise of summer, and somewhere a nightingale sang its complicated song. "Do you ever think about that night at the Pembroke Ball?" I asked, leaning against his side. "About what might have happened if you had not been there, if you had not witnessed my humiliation?" "I think about it often," he admitted, his arm coming around my waist to hold me close. "And I am grateful every time for Lady Constance's cruelty, as strange as that sounds. If she had not attacked you that night, if I had not seen your strength and dignity in the face of her spite, I might never have thought to propose. I might have married some appropriate young lady and lived the rest of my life never knowing what real love felt like. I used to hate her," I confessed, "for making me feel small and worthless, for taking pleasure in my downfall. But now I almost pity her. She had everything society values, beauty, wealth, connections, and yet she had to tear down others to feel superior. She will never know the kind of happiness we have found." "No," Alexander agreed quietly. "She will not, because happiness of this depth requires vulnerability, requires the courage to risk your heart. And I do not think Lady Constance has ever been brave enough for that." We stood in comfortable silence for a while, just being together under the stars, and I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment, the loss of my father and our fortune, the humiliation of becoming a paid companion, the desperation that had made me accept Alexander's cold proposal. All of it had been necessary. Every painful step had led me here, to this garden, to this man, to this life I could never have imagined for myself. "I was so afraid," I said softly. When you proposed, when I accepted, I was terrified that I would spend my entire life loving you without ever being loved in return, that I would be trapped in a marriage that gave me everything except the one thing that truly mattered. And I was afraid, Alexander admitted, that I was incapable of giving anyone what they needed, that I would fail you as I failed Catherine, that I would make you miserable through my own emotional inadequacy. We were both wrong, I said, turning in his arms to face him. So spectacularly, wonderfully wrong. He laughed, the sound rich and warm in the darkness. Yes, thank God we were wrong. Alexander, I said, suddenly serious, do you ever regret it? The scandal we caused at court, the gossip, the way you sacrificed your pride and your privacy for me? Never, he said without hesitation. Not for a single moment. That day at court, when I knelt before you, when I told the entire world that I loved you, that was the most honest, most important thing I have ever done. I would do it again tomorrow if necessary. I would do it 1,000 times over if it meant making you understand how completely, how irrevocably you have claimed my heart. I kissed him then, standing in our garden under the stars, and poured into that kiss everything I could not adequately express in words. My gratitude, my love, my absolute certainty that this was where I belonged. When we finally returned to the house, hand in hand like young lovers, rather than the proper Duke and Duchess we were supposed to be, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing from my life for as long as I could remember. I had been searching for something: security, position, a place in the world. But what I had found was so much more precious than any of those things. I had found home, not in a place or a title, but in a person, in the man who walked beside me, whose hand fit perfectly in mine, who had seen me at my lowest, and loved me not despite it, but because of it. That night, as we lay together in the darkness, Alexander's arms around me and his heartbeat steady beneath my ear, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge the truth I had been dancing around for months. I had been humiliated for being poor. I had been stripped of everything I thought defined me, my position, my prospects, my pride. And in that stripping away of everything superficial, I had discovered what truly mattered. Not wealth or title or social position. Not the approval of society or the fear of scandal. But this connection with another human being who saw me, truly saw me, and loved what he saw. Alexander had offered me his name before the entire court, but what he had really offered me was something far more valuable. He had offered me a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. He had offered me a future filled with possibility rather than limitation. He had offered me his heart, flawed and imperfect and absolutely perfect for me, and in accepting that offer, in choosing to love him despite all my fears and all my walls, I had found something I had stopped believing existed: genuine happiness, the kind that came not from external circumstances, but from internal peace, from the certainty that you were exactly where you were meant to be. What are you thinking about? Alexander murmured against my hair, his voice drowsy but curious. About how grateful I am, I whispered back, for everything, for the good and even for the bad, because it all led me here, to you, to us. His arms tightened around me. I am grateful too, he said, for your courage in accepting my ridiculous proposal, for your patience as I learned how to love you properly, for being the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. I love you, I said, the words still feeling new and precious, even though I said them every day now. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I love you, he replied, his voice full of the emotion he no longer tried to hide. My Duchess, my wife, my Arabella. As sleep began to claim me, safe and warm in his arms, I thought about the girl I had been, frightened, humiliated, convinced that she would never again know security or happiness. I wished I could go back and tell her that everything would be all right, that the suffering she was enduring was not the end of her story, but merely the beginning. I wished I could tell her that she would find love in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person, that she would discover strength she did not know she possessed, that she would learn that true worth had nothing to do with fortune or position, and everything to do with character and courage. But perhaps she needed to discover all of that for herself. Perhaps the journey, painful as it was, had been necessary to bring her to this moment, to this man, to this life. I had been humiliated for being poor. I had lost everything I thought mattered. And in that loss, I had gained something infinitely more valuable. I had gained myself, my true self, stripped of pretense and social masks and the desperate need for approval. And I had gained Alexander, not the cold duke I had married, but the man beneath the title, vulnerable and loving and absolutely perfect. We had both been broken in our own ways, but somehow, impossibly, we had found each other and discovered that our broken pieces fit together in a way that made us both whole. That was the real miracle of our story, not the dramatic declaration at court, not the scandal or the gossip or the fairy tale transformation from companion to duchess, but this quiet certainty that we were meant for each other, that our unlikely marriage had become the greatest love story either of us would ever know. I fell asleep with a smile on my face, my hand resting over Alexander's heart, feeling its steady beat beneath my palm, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was home at last, not in Winterbourne House, though it was beautiful, not in my title, though it had its advantages, but here, in his arms, in this partnership we had built from cold arrangement into genuine love. This was my home. He was my home, and I would never be lost again. Years later, when people would ask me about the scandal that had rocked London society, about the Duke who knelt before his wife in front of the entire court, I would smile and tell them the truth they never quite believed. It was not a scandal. It was a declaration, a promise, a moment when a man brave enough to show vulnerability proved that real love required not just feeling, but action, not just words, but the courage to speak them when it mattered most. And when my daughters, yes, we had 2 beautiful daughters, each with her father's eyes and her mother's determination, asked me how I knew I had married the right man, I told them about that moment, about how their father had sacrificed his pride for my honor, had knelt before the world to defend me, had chosen love over propriety and vulnerability over control. That, I would tell them, is how you know you have found someone worth keeping, not because they give you grand gestures when it is easy, but because they stand beside you, or kneel before you, when it is hard, because they see you at your worst and love you anyway, because they value your happiness above their own comfort. And Alexander, listening from the doorway, would shake his head and smile that particular smile that never failed to make my heart flutter, even after years of marriage. "You make me sound far more heroic than I was," he would protest. "You were," I would insist. "You are, every single day," because that was the truth we had both discovered, that love was not one grand gesture, but 1,000 small ones, repeated daily, building a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. I had been humiliated for being poor, but that humiliation had led me to the greatest treasure I would ever possess, not wealth or title or position, but genuine love shared with a genuine partner. And that, I had learned, was worth more than all the fortunes in England.